What killed Britain's fish and chip shops? That taste, that smell, that Friday ritual we'll never get back. Close your eyes and you're there. 1975, vinegar-soaked newspaper burning your fingers, golden batter cracking open to reveal perfect flaky cod, the street thick with that intoxicating aroma of salt and hot fat. Britain had 35,000 chippies then, beating hearts of every community. Why is it everyone blames McDonald's appearing in 1974? Perhaps the real assassin wasn't American at all. Perhaps it was something quintessentially British, shockingly mundane, and it destroyed a way of life forever. The story of fish and chips isn't as British as you might think. Fried fish came first, brought by Jewish immigrants from Portugal and Spain in the 17th century. They'd prepare pescado frito, fish coated in flour and fried to golden perfection, a tradition from the Iberian Peninsula that crossed oceans and found a new home in London's East End. The chips arrived separately, though historians still debate whether the French or Belgians invented them first. What's certain is that by the mid-19th century, fried potato chips were spreading across England, particularly in the industrial north, where workers needed cheap, filling food that could be eaten quickly. When these two elements finally met, something magical happened. Joseph Malin, a Jewish immigrant, opened the first proper fish and chip shop in London's Bow area around 1860. His small shop proved so wildly popular it stayed in business until the 1970s, serving the same community for over a century. Up in Lancashire near Manchester, John Lees was serving the winning combination from a wooden hut at Mossley Market around 1863. Both men saw something the rest of Britain would soon discover. Fried fish and chips together were absolutely perfect. The timing couldn't have been better. Britain was gripped by the Industrial Revolution, with cities swelling as workers poured in from the countryside seeking employment. They needed food that was cheap, filling, quick to prepare and easy to eat standing up or walking home. Fish and chips ticked every box. The North Sea trawling industry was booming, bringing in massive catches of cod and haddock. New steam-powered fishing vessels, first designed in Leith in 1875, meant fish could be caught and delivered fresh in unprecedented quantities. Meanwhile, potatoes were abundant and inexpensive, the perfect working-class staple. By 1910, there were 25,000 fish and chip shops scattered across Britain. They weren't just restaurants, they were vital community institutions. Working families couldn't afford proper establishments, but a few pennies bought a meal that actually satisfied. Shop owners knew their regulars by name, wrapped portions with practiced precision, and often extended credit to trusted customers who'd fallen on hard times. But what transformed fish and chips from popular food into national identity? When World War I broke out in 1914, the government faced a crucial decision about food rationing. Fish and chips made the protected list. Prime Minister David Lloyd George understood that morale mattered as much as munitions. Working families queuing for their Friday fish supper represented normality, comfort, continuity in a world torn apart by war. The government kept the chippies open and off the ration list throughout the conflict. This decision paid enormous dividends during World War II. Winston Churchill himself called fish and chips the good companions, recognising their importance to British morale during the darkest days of the Blitz. While eggs, meat and bread were strictly rationed, fish and chips remained available. George Orwell, writing in The Road to Wigan Pier in 1937, identified fish and chips as one of the home comforts that kept the masses happy and averted revolution. The post-war years should have been difficult for chippies, with rationing continuing until 1954. Yet fish and chips thrived. The shops represented something precious, a taste of normalcy, a link to pre-war Britain, a small, affordable luxury in years of continued austerity. The number of shops actually grew. By the late 1920s, at the absolute peak, there were 35,000 fish and chip shops operating across Britain. That's one chippy for roughly every 1,000 people. Every neighbourhood had at least one, often two or three. And then came the decade that changed everything. The 1970s sit in memory as a troubled time. the decade of strikes and power cuts, of economic stagnation and political chaos. But for fish and chip shops, the early 70s represented a golden age. Prosperity had returned to working families after the lean post-war years. People had money to spend, but not yet the overwhelming choice of where to spend it. The chippy was still the default Friday night destination, the place where communities gathered. Walk into a typical chip shop in 1974 and you'd find something simultaneously familiar and impossibly distant. The shop was usually narrow, with long queues snaking out the door on Friday and Saturday nights. Families planned their entire week around this ritual. Dad would be sent with a carefully written list, Mum having calculated exactly what everyone wanted. Kids might tag along for the thrill of watching their supper being prepared, pressing their noses against the steamed-up glass. Behind the counter stood the range, a massive piece of equipment that dominated the space. 2 or 3 deep fryers bubbled away constantly, the fat kept at precise temperatures through years of experience rather than any thermometer. The best chip shop owners could tell the temperature by sound and smell alone, an instinct developed over decades. The shops were warm, filled with steam, windows fogged from the temperature differences. But what made the food itself so unforgettable? The preparation was an art form. Fish, usually cod or haddock, would be filleted fresh that morning from suppliers who delivered daily. The batter recipe was often a family secret passed down through generations. Flour, water, sometimes beer, a pinch of baking soda, maybe a splash of vinegar. The exact proportions mattered enormously. Good batter should be light, crispy, never greasy, with a golden colour that spoke of perfect frying. When you lifted your fish, the batter should crack satisfyingly before revealing the flaky white flesh beneath. Chips were hand-cut that morning, usually Maris Piper, thick and uneven in a way that gave each chip character. Then came the wrapping ritual. First, grease-proof paper, white and relatively sterile. The chips would be scooped onto this with practiced movements, a generous portion for just 15 pence. The fish, lifted carefully from the fryer and allowed to drain for just the right number of seconds, was placed on top. Salt and vinegar, always asked, never assumed. Then came the newspaper, yesterday's Daily Mirror or Evening Standard, wrapped around the package with expert folds to provide insulation and absorb excess oil. The smell was distinctive, unmistakable, capable of triggering memories decades later. Salt and malt vinegar combined with the rich aroma of frying fish and hot potato. On cold evenings, particularly in autumn and winter, that smell meant comfort, home, family. It meant Friday night when work was done and the weekend stretched ahead. Shop owners were local celebrities, many Italian families who'd made the fish and chip trade their own. Opening hours were brutal, lunchtime through to after the pubs closed, 6 days a week. But even in this golden age, the first cracks were appearing. Fish and chips weren't just food, they were the architecture around which British working-class life organised itself. Friday was fish and chip night, a rhythm as reliable as church bells or factory whistles. The tradition had religious roots, with Catholics abstaining from meat on Fridays, but it transcended religion, becoming a secular ritual that united communities regardless of faith. In seaside towns, the relationship with fish and chips went even deeper. Blackpool, Scarborough, Brighton, Great Yarmouth built entire tourism industries around the meal. Day trippers would arrive by train or coach, head straight to the promenade, and queue for fish and chips eaten while seagulls wheeled overhead, bold and aggressive, waiting for scraps. The gulls became part of the experience, their piercing cries mixing with the sound of waves and the smell of salt air. The seaside chippy operated differently, with portions often larger and different fish like plaice or skate offered alongside the standard cod. Children's memories of these experiences were particularly vivid. The excitement of choosing your own meal, the responsibility of carrying the wrapped package without dropping it, the anticipation building during the walk home. Eating straight from the paper, fingers burning slightly from the heat, was permitted on special occasions, and somehow tasted better. The tradition extended beyond just eating. Workers leaving factories on Friday afternoon might head straight to the chippy in groups. Courting couples would share portions while walking home. Grandparents would treat grandchildren, continuing traditions they'd inherited from their own grandparents. The meal connected generations, each teaching the next the proper way. Salt first, then vinegar, never the other way around. Mushy peas were a northern tradition that never quite conquered the south. Made from marrow-fat peas soaked overnight and cooked until they collapsed into thick green mush, they divided opinions sharply. Northerners considered them essential, Southerners found them baffling. Chip shop culture included its own vocabulary too. Scraps or bits were the crispy fragments of batter that broke off during frying, given free to children who asked nicely. Then came the invasion that nobody saw coming. In November 1974, a restaurant opened on Powis Street in Woolwich, southeast London, that would change British eating habits forever. McDonald's had arrived. The first UK branch seemed almost exotic with its bright colours, plastic furniture and revolutionary counter service. Americans living in London made pilgrimages across the city to get their fix of a Mac burger, fries and coffee, all for 50p. The British public didn't immediately understand what they were seeing. The idea of ordering food at a counter, receiving it within minutes and eating it quickly in a casual environment was familiar from chip shops, but McDonald's presented it with American polish and efficiency. Everything was standardized, measured, timed. McDonald's expanded rapidly. By 1977, there were 10 restaurants. By 1985, nearly 200. The company deliberately targeted families with children, positioning itself as a treat destination with bright colours, the clown mascot, and Happy Meals with toys. But McDonald's wasn't the only invader. Wimpy had arrived in the 1950s but expanded during the 1970s. Kentucky Fried Chicken followed, then Burger King. By the late 1970s, the high street was transforming, offering choices that hadn't existed before. Chinese takeaways were expanding even faster. According to Hong Kong government data, there were only 1,406 Chinese restaurants in the UK in 1970. By 1980, that number had exploded. The economic setback of Britain in the 1970s actually helped these businesses. With people unwilling to pay high prices when eating out, immigrants from Hong Kong's new territories opened cheap takeaway shops that undercut traditional restaurants. Indian takeaways followed a similar pattern, particularly in cities with large student populations. The competition changed consumer behaviour fundamentally. For generations, the question on Friday night wasn't what to eat, but which chippy to go to. By 1980, the question had become whether to have fish and chips, Chinese, Indian or American fast food. The Chippies monopoly was broken forever. The 1970s also saw massive inflation. A portion that cost around 25p in 1970 had reached 83p by 1980, a more than threefold increase in a single decade. Yet price wasn't the biggest killer. In the early 1980s, a series of regulations began to change everything. Health and safety legislation, driven partly by European Union directives, targeted the traditional practices that had defined chip shops for over a century. The most symbolic change came with newspaper wrapping. For generations, fish and chips had arrived wrapped in yesterday's news, the print sometimes transferring onto the greasy paper beneath. The authorities declared this practice unhealthy. Newspaper ink contained chemicals, possibly lead, that might contaminate food. Never mind that the fish never actually touched the newspaper directly, separated by grease-proof paper. Never mind that generations of Britons had eaten this way without apparent ill effects. The regulations were clear. Newspapers were out. By the mid-1980s, you couldn't legally wrap food in old newspapers anymore. Some shops switched to plain newsprint-style paper bought from suppliers. Others used boring white paper or polystyrene containers that felt sterile and wrong. The ritual of unwrapping your fish and chips, of reading headlines through translucent grease, was gone. Something ineffable was lost. Critics argued it was health and safety gone mad, killing tradition for marginal benefits. Both defenders and critics were right. Other regulations followed. Shops had to upgrade equipment to meet new standards. The old ranges had to be replaced with modern fryers. Temperature controls became mandatory. The cost of compliance hit small family businesses hardest. The single shop owner faced buying new fryers, new ventilation systems, upgrading premises. Many couldn't afford it. Some sold up. Others cut corners, which only accelerated their decline. Fish prices were rising too, driven by declining North Sea stocks. Cod became increasingly expensive as overfishing reduced catches. European fishing quotas limited what British trawlers could catch. Shop owners switched to cheaper alternatives, haddock, pollock, or even imported frozen fish. Customers noticed the difference. The customer base was changing as well. Traditional industries were collapsing. Coal mines closed, steelworks shut down, shipyards fell silent. The workers who'd queued every Friday were disappearing, and their children had different habits. They'd grown up with McDonald's, with Chinese food, with Indian curry. Fish and chips was what their parents ate. Shopping habits shifted too. Supermarkets with extended hours meant people could buy frozen fish and oven chips to cook at home. Microwave ovens, barely known in Britain in 1970, were in millions of homes by 1990. Ready meals and frozen foods made going to the chippy less necessary. The answer isn't simple. Fish and chip shops weren't killed by a single cause, but by a perfect storm of cultural, economic, and regulatory changes that made them increasingly irrelevant to modern British life. McDonald's gets blamed, and certainly American fast food chains accelerated the decline. But even without the golden arches, Chippies faced existential threats. The death of newspaper wrapping, while seemingly trivial, symbolized a broader loss of identity. Fish and chips had been defined partly by ritual, by tradition, by the whole experience of ordering, waiting, unwrapping, eating. When regulations stripped away these rituals in the name of hygiene and safety, what remained was just fried fish and potatoes. Still good, still filling, but no longer special. Competition from takeaways offering different cuisines was perhaps more important than McDonald's. Chinese and Indian food provided variety that fish and chips couldn't match. A chip shop's menu was limited by its equipment and expertise. A Chinese takeaway could offer dozens of dishes. Fish and chips was familiar, comforting, but also boring. Curry was exciting, exotic, an adventure. The collapse of traditional working-class communities removed the social foundation that had sustained Chippies for decades. Fish and chips was embedded in a whole way of life. Factory work, tight-knit neighbourhoods, Friday as payday. As that world disappeared, replaced by service industries, suburban sprawl, and changing family structures, the Friday chippy ritual lost its cultural mooring. Rising costs hit small businesses particularly hard. Fish prices increased significantly. Energy costs for keeping fryers hot all day were substantial. Labour costs rose. Small shops couldn't compete on price with large chains that could buy supplies in bulk and operate on thinner margins. The economics simply stopped working for the traditional single-shop owner. Quality declined in many surviving shops as owners cut corners to stay profitable. Cheaper fish, cheaper oil, smaller portions all eroded what had made the meal special. Customers noticed and went elsewhere. Meanwhile, the best chippies often couldn't charge enough to cover their costs. Premium fish and chips didn't fit consumer expectations. From 35,000 shops in the late 1920s, the number fell to about 11,000 by the early 2000s. That represents a two-thirds decline over 70 years. When your local chippy shut its doors for the last time, something more than a shop disappeared. It was a connection to the past, to a way of life that was gone and wouldn't return. If you're feeling nostalgic for more stories about the Britain we remember, check out the recent video on the 17 old British shops that once stood strong on the high street alongside your favourite chippy. What killed Britain's fish and chip shops wasn't McDonald's or regulations or rising costs. It was the death of the Britain they served. A world where Friday meant fish and chips as reliably as Sunday meant church, where tight-knit communities gathered around their local chippy, and where that smell of vinegar on newspaper meant home. We gained choice and convenience, but we lost something precious. Not just a meal, but a piece of who we were wrapped in yesterday's news and impossible to recover.